Hello, and thank you for joining us for Achates Live. Today, we're going to be focusing on the subject of the case for support, and in particular, how organisations navigate the tensions that arise when trying to make a cohesive and powerful set of key arguments for work at a national and local level. As part of today's discussion, we'll share examples of how different organisations have made a case for both, highlighting the success and challenges they've faced and what they've learned along the way. Our conversation today will be chaired by our Achates Director of Development, Deborah Larwood, who will be joined by our panellists from New Writing North and Northern Ballet. My name's Cordelia Millwood, and I'm a development manager here at Achates. Achates is a creative consultancy with a holistic approach to fundraising, recruitment, and strategy. We take our name from Greek and Roman mythology, as Achates was a close friend and loyal advisor to Aeneas, which echoes the role that we hope to play supporting the cultural sector. Achates Live was set up to create a space for fundraisers and arts professionals to come together and support each other by sharing learning as well as some of the challenges we face in response to an ever-changing cultural context. Our role at Achates is to facilitate an overview of the sector, providing perspective in a supportive way. So before I hand over to Deborah, I should mention that all the information shared today is live and correct at the point of recording, and this is a pre-recorded session on the 25th of May. So please feel free to use the comment box below to share any thoughts, or alternatively, if you would like to ask us specific questions about anything, please drop us a line at info@achates.org.uk, and one of the team will get back to you. Now, without further ado, over to you, Deborah.
Thanks very much, Cordelia, and good afternoon, everybody. Now, the case for support is a set of key arguments for an organisation and its work, and it should summarise the range of perspectives and impacts that potential donors will be interested in aligning with and ultimately supporting. Whilst traditionally in the UK, a cultural sector case for support argument was a rhetorical one, in recent years, with the introduction of a more rigorous and formal investment basis for funding, this has evolved into a format which includes the articulation of an organisation's purpose and theory of change. With regards to seeking contributed income, partnerships and advocacy, we know that the key lies in identifying and highlighting the most compelling facet of your case for support to further your objectives. And that isn't new news. However, there has been an interesting divergence in focus between the national significance piece and the more recent placing of priority on the local context, and in some cases, a real push towards the hyperlocal focus. For funders such as Arts Council England to Esme Fairbairn and the Paul Hamlyn Foundation, it's now imperative that an organisation can articulate a deeper understanding of the communities that it's seeking to engage and can demonstrate its commitment to both understanding the needs of these communities and then taking this knowledge to reflect these considerations into the approach to its work. Without that evidence, it's undoubtedly far more challenging to secure the confidence and the investment from these funders in the current funding landscape. What we're talking about is a deep and meaningful connection between culture and audiences and participants, where culture is part of society and not above it. But what about the national significance? How do we make the argument that our work has meaning in this context? And what does that impact look like? Arts Council England defines nationally significant work as that which has significant potential to develop the creative and cultural sector in England, or work which engages or influences significant numbers of people in England beyond the organisation's own geographic area. It seems to me that this is an interesting priority to make a case against, and one where organisations can certainly be creative in how they make it. For example, it could be about national and international collaboration, the driving of inward investment, or replicating models of working into other geographic locations. Ultimately, of course, both arguments find their meeting point in the story of impact, and in particular, interrogating the change which is being brought about by the work. Now, I'm delighted to be joined today by two colleagues working in the sector, and I'm so looking forward to digging into their thoughts and experiences on this topic. So without further delay, It's my pleasure to introduce the first of our two panellists, Claire Malcolm, founder and chief executive of New Writing North. Claire is, as I say, founder and chief exec at New Writing North, which is the writing development organisation for the north of England that produces major literary awards and prizes, festivals and events and programmes to support writers from underrepresented backgrounds to access industry opportunities. She's currently developing a new flagship centre for writing in Newcastle upon Tyne and has recently been part of the team that has launched a new MA in publishing with Achates UK and Northumbria University. New Writing North was shortlisted for the National Charity Awards 2021 for its work with young people, and Claire was awarded an MBE for services to literature and young people. She holds an honorary Doctor of Letters from Durham University and is one of the booksellers 150 people influencing publishing. Hello, Claire.
Hi, Deborah. Great to be here today.
Brilliant to have you with us. And secondly, I'm delighted to welcome David Collins, Executive Director at Northern Ballet. David joined Northern Ballet in January of this year to form a new leadership team alongside recently appointed Artistic Director Federico Bonelli. Northern Ballet are based in Leeds, from where they tour extensively across the UK and internationally. Alongside the professional company of 37 dancers, Northern Ballet is also a centre of excellence for teaching ballet in the north of England, and it delivers extensive community and schools outreach work. David joined Northern Ballet from Opera North, where he was Exec Director and Deputy CEO. In that role, he led the fundraising campaign for the company's major capital project to create the Howard Opera Centre and transform the Howard Assembly Room as a performance venue with new public spaces in the heart of Leeds. Before moving to Yorkshire to join Opera North, David was head of marketing at the Royal Shakespeare Company, working on productions in Stratford-upon-Avon and London and on tour nationally and internationally, as well as the launch of Live from the RSC cinema broadcasts and the capital transformation of the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. Good afternoon, David.
Hi, Deborah. Thank you so much for inviting me to take part.
Great to have you with us too. So I'm going to kick off today's conversation really by inviting both Claire and David to give us a little bit of context and background really into their own experience and thoughts on how they've made or how they're making a case for support at their own organisations, how they've positioned those key arguments and why, and any particular learning or challenges that they may have noted along the way. Claire, can I come to you first? Would that be okay?
That would be fine. So I think it's very interesting, both David and I are from the north, because I think that potentially brings a bit of a tone to the conversation today. So I run an organisation that is based in Newcastle and that works across the north of England, which is a very large geographic area, as I'm sure you'll all understand. So when I'm talking about what we do, I tend to focus on our organisation as a gateway or a route into speaking to a broad audience and a broad reach of writers and creatives across the north. And I found that works kind of well for us in terms of national partners, in terms of how they might understand the north and see us as a place in the north where they can do business or have partnership. But I think it's fair to say, huge problems with this idea of nationally significant organisations. And I don't think I've ever quite heard those Arts Council definitions that you read out earlier, Deborah. I think they're really inconclusive, aren't they, in terms of how you'd actually ever really prove some of that. And I wonder, I suppose, as a lifelong northerner and a champion of the arts in the north, I sometimes wonder why you have to be nationally significant, why you can't be regionally significant, or just significant within your art form, you know. Of course, there is a competition to funding, that is always there, but I think sometimes we're being led to jump through the wrong hoops in terms of thinking about who we are. I've recently been doing work on the business case and the development case for the setting up of a new capital project, which would be to create a centre for writing in Newcastle, which would have huge impact here locally in the northeast, but also be a beacon and a network organisation for the north more generally. And that's been really interesting, having to make a case for what I would consider to be a nationally significant development because of its scale, because of its ambition, because of the reach of what it wants to do. But we are not a national organisation. the work we do in that building, we will not be delivering national program. We might do some programs that are nationally focused, we might not. But it should be enough that we will benefit a huge amount of people and creatives where we are. But it's been very interesting because one of the things I've had to do as part of that development is really dig in a hyperlocal way. So we have spent most of, for the last, since 2012, when we've been working across the North, I've spent a long time making a broader case for the North. And with this development, I've had to do both a very hyperlocal Northeastern case and a kind of national, the North as a national kind of thing case. So I've been working on both those fronts. And it's interesting. It does make you think about yourself and your practice differently. And I think we maybe need to get better at being able to think about ways we describe the practice of what we do as nationally significant or of national quality. But I think so much of that is often hidden in the regions because a lot of organisations are working and doing brilliant things in the regions, and they don't think about the national role they might play in influencing practice or developing artists. We have had to get quite good at doing that, I think, over the years because of the partners, such as broadcasters and publishers, that we've wanted to attract to invest in our projects and our work. So we have, I think, got used to doing that. But I think it's a tricky issue, kind of trying to make a case for being nationally significant when really that might not be your focus. It might be a secondary thing that happens from the work you do. And I think there are still some, things that people perhaps are not very open about. I have talked to funders who I know think we just can't be nationally significant because we are Northern and focused on the North. And we took over the management a few years ago of the David Cohen Literature Prize, which is the UK Nobel Prize. It's a massive lifetime achievement literary award. And I remember people saying to me when we did that, "Oh my God, are you going to move it to Newcastle?" I said, no, it's always happened in London, so it will happen in London. We will just run it from Newcastle. And there was a huge amount of disbelief that you could run nationally significant. I mean, that's internationally significant, from the regions, So that's still there. It is still there. And I think in lots of people's minds, including a lot of funders, nationally significant means based in London, So I slightly rest my case on that. So I'm a bit cross about this because I do come up against it. And I think the big change for us in the North, and especially now in the Northeast, is devolution, because I think that will change where some of the money really is, in a way that levelling up and the beauty parade of competition around that kind of money hasn't genuinely changed any of that. So I'm hopeful that that might both strengthen organisations in the region and allow them to maybe be a bit more nationally significant, with where they might be able to tour work or make work or profile their work as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Claire. Really appreciate your thoughts and your opinions, and I think I'm sure many people watching will really share some of the perhaps sort of frustration, particularly when we think about national significance and the capital. I think it's very often that we end up talking about those two things side by side, and I really liked what you were saying about the sort of the meaning of significance, and that might be significance within your art form. You also talked about scale, ambition and reach, and I think that that's interesting, both from sort of a local a focus, but also on that sort of the benefiting a larger number of people. Perhaps that would absolutely play into the national significance piece. Also, I was interested in what you were saying about attracting partners, and in order to bring about those perhaps commercial or broadcasting partners, that talking about the work that you're doing, influencing practice, and also developing the creative sector workforce, that they're really compelling reasons why a partner might be attracted to work alongside you. So
yeah. Just if I may, on impact, because I hadn't thought of it, but what you just said made me think of it in terms of that kind of tension between being able to talk and demonstrate and show real impact in your work, which tends to be longer, deeper, embedded relationships that enable the kind of genuine change we want to see in participants who are engaging with work. That's very hard to do at scale. And most of us, with the best will in the world, are not funded anywhere near the kind of levels where you could be doing that at scale. And also, it's very hard to get continual funding for those kind of programs. We have a number of schools and young people's programs here at New Writing North that are embedded, where we have people in school context year round, and we work very hard fundraising for that in a continual hamster wheel of trying to find new ways to do it. That work delivers incredible impact stories and case studies and really life-changing things that really help lever funding. But there's a kind of catch-22 there. So, you know, if you're saying you can only be nationally significant for your practice if you're reaching thousands of people, literally street festivals, people walking past looking at things, that's very different to life-changing work with the people who need it the most, delivered hyperlocally and in areas of great need. I think that's something we perhaps don't talk about enough, where practice in those contexts might be really innovative, might be world class because of the impact it can demonstrate, but perhaps we'll just never receive the kind of increase or level of funding that it needs to be sustained.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something interesting as well, I think, breadth versus depth. And not necessarily that one is sort of better than the other. I think it probably comes down to context and specific areas of work. But yeah, there are some things in there that I would love to dig into a bit deeper, I think, when we come to some questions. David, it'd be great to hear your perspective on your experience of building that case for support.
I really enjoyed everything Claire had to say, because I agree with it all. And yeah, so I guess I'm relatively new into Northern Ballet from Opera North, but that's only a 5-minute walk across Leeds. So I guess I'll talk to both organisations if that's okay. And I think, you know, there's a lot of similarities between these two organisations. So we're both based in Leeds, and we're creating work here, but we're both touring organisations. So our job, I guess, the core of what we do is to get that work out and around the country. And I think both organisations probably find themselves tripping over the stuff that Claire was talking around in terms of what does it mean for us to be nationally significant, and in terms of the work we create, what does that mean? And I think it's about quality, isn't it? Our job is to create work that connects with people who want to frankly come and see it and engage with it and are impacted by it, or have an emotional or physical response to the work we're creating. And if we're doing that job well and creating quality work for the people where we tour, surely that means we're a company of national significance, whether or not we choose to tour that work into London. It's in these organisations and in this bit of the sector, quite often I think, you know, national significance, what does it mean? Does it mean press coverage? Does it mean if we invest in a really exciting, fantastic quality product, a piece of creativity that opens in Leeds, but therefore we don't get national press coverage, it's not nationally significant? Or if peers in a sector aren't able to come to Leeds to see this and make this fantastic piece of work, does that mean it's not significant? But actually it's of extreme quality. It connects with an audience in Leeds or in Newcastle or Manchester, but somehow it can be judged as not significant and not of national importance, which is, I'm possibly just airing frustration now, but I feel like that's what we're here to do. We both of these organisations I'm working with and work for would make the case that we're absolutely creating work of the highest possible standard, and we're incredibly proud to be doing it in Yorkshire, and that means something. And we want to connect work with that really impacts on people's lives and their understanding of the world around them. I was also one thought is around we'll probably come into it, philanthropy, because I do think that there's the London aspect in terms of press reach and profile and industry. There's also something very real about philanthropy. Both these organisations are supported well by people who are very proud that we're based in the North and in Yorkshire in particular. And there's a very local connection and case for support we build out on that basis. And a lot of the work we deliver beyond the work on stage, whether it be in schools and community settings, is, you know, that is important and relevant for those reasons. But it's also the case particularly coming into Northern Ballet and doing some work around prospecting and research, who are the people who might support this organisation? They're based in the capital, a lot of them. So there's an interesting question we need to ask ourselves around developing a case for support for that cohort of people. Should they be people who should support the work we do? Are they only going to support us, and therefore should we build a presence in London to have that profile with those people, or is our case for support different for that group of people? Those are questions we're asking ourselves at the moment. I just wanted to come back to something Claire said, which I hadn't thought of before, but I thought was really, really, really strong, was around some of the other work we do. You know, both Opera North, through a project called In Harmony, which was working in multiple schools in Leeds, has a profound impact on all of the students in 7 primary schools. It is of national significance in terms of the quality and reach and impact it has, but it's in Leeds, so doesn't get that, I don't think, the recognition it necessarily deserves in terms of what it's achieving. And the same thing at Northern Ballet through our Rise and Shine programs. There's long-term profound impact on the lives of young people through dance in that instance, in a series of schools that I think is of extreme quality and importance, but because it's I think its strength is in fact it's hyperlocal, but you know, that doesn't play to being of national significance, which is problematic, I guess. Yeah.
Thanks, David. The point about the prospects is a really interesting one, I think, because we know from the Arts Council Private Investment in Culture Survey 2022 that the lion's share of philanthropy is absolutely in the capital, or directed to the capital. So there is that, that's the context within which I suppose we're operating as a sector. And it's interesting to think about why those individuals in the capital might be drawn to support organisations and their work in other parts of the country, and how you can build those relationships and make that case for support, versus the way in which you bring a more local donor or philanthropist along with you, and where you might place focus in terms of the work you're delivering and the impact that it's having. With regards to cultural policy, I thought this would be a really interesting starting point for us, because we've seen some really interesting movement, I think, in terms of cultural policy, particularly off the back of things like COVID and the economic climate, for example. And I'd be really interested, David, if I could start with you, to ask, with that sort of cultural policy in mind, the investment and the focus on the hyperlocal approach has become really important there. How do you think an organisation can make its local case for support more compelling within that cultural policy environment?
I think being genuinely understanding the context in which it exists, and the people around it, the communities around it, and I think first understanding, and then wanting to make an absolute commitment to creating work that is for those people, that is with those people. And that's I think big organisations like Opera North and Northern Ballet, that's a shift for us. And not we haven't been doing it, but I think we're having to think really differently around how we make work with people that really embeds us in communities in a different way. Absolutely, a huge amount of what we do is about presenting work. Because of the nature of the organisations, we present work in big old buildings that people have to come and sit in a particular set of seats to watch. That's not going to change, and the stories we tell need to be ones that people feel speak to them, and they want to frankly buy a ticket and come and see. But I think beyond that, organisations like ourselves have to start thinking about how we use our resources in different ways. So a good example, I think, would be Opera North, just now actually, is delivering a project in a part of Leeds called Richmond Hill. And it was very much, the idea behind the project was to look at what the organisation had, which is an orchestra and chorus, so 55 players, 36 musicians, and to rethink about how they could build a connection that was of relevance to a particular part of our city. It was a part of the city we already had a link into through one of the In Harmony schools. So we were delivering work in that part of the city, and also beginning to build out work outside of school hours for parents of those pupils and into other areas of the community. And over a year, we built a community sounding board who met with people from staff from Opera North to play with what an engagement of that, a residency of Opera North in that part of the city would look like, and to be led by different community groups or leaders or community leaders within that part of the city, and ultimately offering up our players on our chorus to come and make work with alongside people, and to see where it led. It's very much an experiment. What does that look like? Does that add relevance in a truly sort of hyper local way for an organisation like Opera North? And what came through from it is a desire to really make lasting change. And I think what the sense was that people in that part of Leeds, for lots of different reasons, didn't have access to cultural provision, whether it's because there wasn't any locally, or there are barriers or for that group of people to come into the centre of Leeds to experience a company like Opera North. So what it's resulted in is a lot of work in the community, a lot of work with the community and sort of co-creation, as well as hopefully, though I've now left, building bridges for people to come in and experience work in the city centre that they weren't otherwise doing.
Absolutely. I think it comes down to that sort of, as you say, co-creating, but a shifting of power. And again, when we think about the funding landscape, I can think of numerous funders who are particularly vocal about that's what they were that's what they want to see. They want to see organisations sharing that power and empowering people to make decisions about how they participate in culture. So that's a really interesting example. Thank you, David. Claire, what are your thoughts on how an organisation can make its local case for support more compelling within that cultural policy context?
For me, I think it's about how useful you are as an organisation, or one of the starting points is that. And we had COVID was a very interesting time, for lots of us. We're not a building-based organisation yet. So there was a whole thread for us running through COVID, which is just, what are we here to do? If we had to survive this, what is our role in the city? What do we bring here? And we went through a kind of business transformation process and quite hard thinking about how useful we were as an organisation. And we made some changes coming out of that, which were about where we decided to place work, where we could work really smartly around strategic partnerships to address broader concerns. So yes, we want to run creative or narrative power workshops with communities, but where do we do them? And in Newcastle specifically, there are certain areas of town or the city that are clustered with every arts organisation trying to deliver things with the most disadvantaged people, which creates a real distortion sometimes, and is really the result of some not very smart thinking, or some, not thinking very long about where you might do things. So we tried to look at some other places where we could work across society-based partnerships, so with the NHS and with social providers, and in places where we wouldn't usually find ourselves. And some of them we had to get to know them to work out whether or not we kind of could be there. And then you are inevitably engaging with lots of different local data and information and contextual information, which I think then makes it easier to see what you do bring to the table, and how you do fit into addressing kind of localized concerns and needs. And I think, we know arts organizations have an amazing role to play in lots of different contexts. And that can be both a blessing and a curse, in that we can be spread incredibly far. But I think done smartly, you can really empower certain kinds of interventions or lead them, as we have been doing in certain areas, which is a slightly different way of working, or it has been for us. But the results are impactful and they're interesting, and it changes how you think about making work in a positive way. So I think it's about that. It's about really understanding local context. And until I was having to work on cases for supports for a big capital project, we hadn't really done that work. We'd done it very lightly. I could tell you about literacy figures generically in the Northeast. I could tell you about poverty, but they're quite broad stories. And digging into our business case, working up theories of change for some of the things we think we're doing within community contexts has been really helpful, and it's brought a lot of different information to the table that has been inspiring or has given us different kind of things to riff off and think about when we're kind of designing programs or thinking about interventions. But I think basically, the conversation we had is, how are we useful? We can do certain things. We know how to do certain things really well. Where most needs that now? Where can we have the most impact? And I think often organizations don't stop to ask that. We often are working in places we've worked for years because we have good networks there. It's easy. You build speculative funding bids around those kind of partnerships, and it can be quite hard to step outside of them. But I think we've managed to do that a bit, and we've found some really interesting things that then have led often to different types of funding possibilities. But in essence, they allow us to tell incredibly good hyperlocal stories.
Deborah, there's something really interesting, because in the sort of organisation like Northern Valley or Up North, I think sometimes, I don't subscribe to this, but sometimes it could feel that the community engagement is something you have to do with this hand, while this hand is touring work of big operas and ballets. And the two things are separate things, and the organisation must do both of these things. So please, let's have two departments. You go off and do that. We'll do this. And I think the difficult growing pain that we're going through to get to a better place, I think, is what is the relationship between those two things. And if you do the community engagement, as Claire said, if you really take the time to dig in and to understand and to create something that's genuinely meaningful, and you find the right way of infusing that and overlaying it with in some senses, the core of what we do. I don't mean that, but if that has a direct connection to all of the work we're creating and who we are as an organisation, my view would be that in the medium and longer term, that enriches the whole. Surely that makes the whole thing make much more sense. That's why we should be getting the funding we're getting from the public purse, or from trusts and foundations, or from philanthropists, because we're doing it right. We're taking the time to really make those connections. And I think there's a shift we have to go through from when it's done badly, that it exists in those two silos, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's something interesting as well, I think, about working with those local partners who are on the ground, who are already engaging with the communities that you're trying to reach. That's hugely helpful to, I suppose, to dispel any of the assumptions that we might be making as cultural organizations, right? We sort of assume things about different audiences and communities and what they do and don't want or need. And actually, going back to the point I was making at the top of today's session, that move away from rhetoric to that theory of change-based approach. Actually, as David says, if we can get it right, and we actually take the time to understand what people need, how they want to engage, then one might assume that will actually lead to better engagement, which is also what we're all driving for. And I think what you were saying before, Claire, about understanding how your provision sits within the ecology of your locale is really important, so that we're not sort of trying to do the same things to the same groups of people. And I think that idea of partnership working and joining forces, well, that's where better impact is achieved. In terms of the case for support, Claire, I'm interested to ask you, working with those local partners, having access to that deeper understanding, that data, how does your case for support perhaps compare sort of now versus maybe what it used to look like? Do you feel that there is a more robust, sort of granular case for support that you've been able to develop?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's slightly embarrassing for me to say this, but we've had to look very closely at the stories we tell, which you would think, irony, a creative writing organisation would be very well placed to do really well. But it took us a while to work out how best to tell our own story. And the approach we've taken to that is both kind of working out how to do our data in the kind of fog of all the things that Arts Council require, most of which aren't directly useful in this kind of case making, and some of the other funders we work with. There's a myriad of things we report to because of all the different funding streams we have. But in between all that, we've worked out some baseline ways of evaluating what we do, which allows us to aggregate data up as well to present more compelling things. But we've mainly done it through detailed case studies. So we are ruthless now at capturing the stories of some of the people we work with and continuing. One of the things about New Writing North that we always do is have longer term relationships with people. So we tend to see through relationships. So we do see change that might take 2 or 3 years to really manifest in young people or in new talented kind of writers that we're working with. But we become a lot more sorted about how we gather and present that information now, and it's those stories that say what you can't, which is this is why we're doing this is why we get up every day, this is why you should give us the money for it, because here is a young person telling you that their life was changed and they went into education, or they started going back to school, or whatever the outcome, big and small. And we've done some of that through an ethnographic approach to embedded research as well. So we have kind of observational researchers, I guess we would call them, in place in some of the projects. So we're tracking change in quite a granular way through observing the people that are taking part in things. So we're not just relying on a questionnaire at the end of the program or at the end of the season of writing groups or whatever. We're employing someone to kind of look at the changes happening in people and to capture some of the things they're saying along the way. That has been quite transformational because that showed us completely different things about the work that we were doing that we hadn't either been able to describe or hadn't even thought about trying to articulate before. So our case for support now is the strategic goals, the kind of theory of change work, really deep work around that in lots of different areas, but it's the case studies that really sell it. And they also enable my trustees and champions that we have in quite a simple way, because not everyone wants to look at a theory of change, and not everyone can, get their heads around that. But a case study, a good story, well told, I think remains the most persuasive thing most of us can do to show why we're worth investing in.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Claire. I'm really taken by the idea of investing in that resource to actually monitor and evaluate as a project moves along. I think, possibly because of the stretch of resource that we tend to find in the sector, it's chronic, can often mean that actually that's the sort of thing that we don't manage to invest in. And then it's only towards the end of a project, perhaps, that we then try to pull things together and ensure that we've got evidence and we've done our due diligence and we're able to report back to funders and donors on what they've helped us to achieve. But thinking about embedding that from the get-go, I think is inspired. That's really
we've also trained some of a lot of the longer term programs we have kind of producers who do work with us year round on a freelance basis, and we've trained some of those and some of the people that deliver the work in those practices as well. So they're not working at a really high kind of, it's not their profession, but as part of the work they do for us, they are alert to being able to collect some of that information. Because it's not realistic to have that kind of embedded research in every project. It would be great, but will probably never be the case.
Sure, absolutely, great. I'm going to move us along to think about that balance of making a local or a hyperlocal case for support versus the national significance piece. I'm interested to ask you both to what degree you think there is a tension, but more than that, really, if an organisation can make a credible case for both, and how one might do that. David, I might come to you first on that, if that's okay.
Yes. What do I think? Certainly, what I'm experiencing at the moment is that's where we're headed. So we're looking at the early stages of our statement of purpose and our theory of change. We're going through that process and trying to hold ourselves to account really clearly around who we're for. Do we really understand the people we're here, we exist to serve? And we're building towards then a refreshed case for support. And as I said earlier in the conversation, what's falling out of a mapping of the people who support this organisation is that they are geographically dispersed. There's a definite cohort who back us because of our location in Yorkshire, and there's another cohort predominantly in the southeast who might like us for a different reason. So I think as we first need to get real clarity on the work we want to create for who and what's the impact we want to have in the world. And I think as we move through that process, I think we then need to think about who are the people who can help us achieve it, and are they going to want to help us achieve different things for different reasons. And I suspect the answer is yes. My suspicion in terms of art is an art form based case for support that we will evolve for, say, as potential supporters in the Southeast, which goes, with the earlier conversation, what does nationally significant mean? But what's our art form significance in terms of a place of excellence for training and developing dancers, and inclusive development and opportunity for lots of different people to engage in this art form, through to we, the organisation, who are looking to find the new voices, interesting voices, who we can give a platform to, we can give a stage to, who can develop work. So is there an art form case for support that we can frankly engage with people who live in London a bit, as well as some local supporters, versus that understanding of what our impact is in this city and in this region. So we're in this building, it's a school, it's not only a place where a professional company of dancers live, it's a place where hundreds of people come to learn to dance, whether they're on a trajectory to become a professional dancer, or whether they're just doing it because, I don't know, that it's a reason to connect with other people and try something new, and it improves their health and well-being. There's a whole different set of a slant on the case for support there that I suspect will tease out and will play to a different audience, or might play to different funders. I mean, there's a whole series of Venn diagrams where different people have different interests, and I can think of supporters who supported this organisation or Opera North for a myriad of those reasons. And I guess ultimately every individual or trust reason for supporting something is very complex and very personal and rooted in, did that person grow up in Yorkshire and go on to do things in life, and they're not based here anymore, but they have an emotional connection to the place they grew up, so therefore they'll want to support us, versus someone who's just purely in it for the art form and the interest that we're working with an interesting choreographer. And yeah, that's where we are. We're really at the start of that journey and building those multiple cases for support. But I guess we can't be everything to everyone. We don't want to be. We need to be really, really focused on what we're here to do, and what in our case for support or our statement of purpose is unique. Because I mean, you and I have had this conversation, Deborah. You can read a bunch of statements of purpose, and it could be for any large arts organisation in the UK. We need to be a bit more focused than that. But yes, I think ultimately we'll end up with nuanced cases of support.
Great, thank you, David. As you were talking, it made me think about, you're sort of mentioning about an art form based case for support, and I can absolutely see why that's a really interesting angle to take for major philanthropists who maybe are, for example, based in London. But thinking about trusts and foundations, for example, we know that what they want to see in terms of their investment is the most impact possible, and some of that impact is perhaps a butterfly effect or residual impact. And I was just thinking before about the Paul Hamlyn Foundation, for example, who I know, they're an example of a funder that will, within the scope of a grant, be open to something like an allowance for some sort of sharing, so a symposium or a conference or a workshop, where an organisation can effectively share its best practice. And I was thinking about the Leeds Playhouse, who, were fundraising against their work with communities with dementia, and they ended up creating, I think, sort of a guidebook or a handbook for the sector around how to make work which is dementia friendly and what the considerations are. I wonder what your thoughts are around, is that a direction of travel that more organisations might want to sort of consider thinking about, to unlock those trusts and foundations to make that national significance or sector influence story?
Yes, I think so. I think it goes back to what Claire was saying, though. Organisations find it really hard, for lots of reasons, to be really rigorous around measuring impact generally. And I think, you should do that work, because it will. Funders want to know, as you said earlier, Deborah, funders want to know they invest in you, what's the result of that investment. So absolutely, I think that's something that we should all be looking to do for that reason. But I also think it plays to understanding the quality of your own work. What's your internal process for understanding the reach impact of the work you're doing? And I think too often arts organisations are too quick to move to the next thing, and we're all pressured. We don't have enough time, we don't have enough money, and we're ambitious, so we're looking for the next goal and the next goal and the next goal. I think, yes, that sort of work, that sort of deeper analysis that you share with other people is the right thing for us to be doing. It improves our relationship with funders, but I also think it improves the quality and the rigor of the work we're all creating. But it's difficult because it takes time, it takes resource to put those structures in place. I was really struck by Claire talking about the base baseline data you've got, because you're right, we're also all reporting to different funders, different metrics, different things that they want us to understand, and that's it's a bit of a hamster wheel of sometimes of doing that stuff. But I think if within that you can have a baseline set of data also that allows you to do that stuff more easily, but also is genuinely of importance to you, I think that's really valuable. I've left now, so I don't know where they got to, but Opera North were in the process of doing a really interesting piece of work about data aggregation. They were taking different data sets and bringing them together into one database to create dynamic dashboards, so they could really understand in a live fashion the reach, the impact, and the performance of their work. I think that sort of thing is what we should all be investing some time and effort into.
Completely agree with that, David. And I think this is a huge shift for our sector to be making. I think, we've only got to look at this round of Arts Council NPO applications, and I think there has been a marked shift to having, needing that clear, detailed baseline data to be able to set targets. And I think, that was challenging for many organisations because we don't necessarily have that practice wholly embedded. It's sort of to a greater or lesser extent depending on where you are. Claire, I'd love to ask you about working with colleagues, with trustees, when really thinking about developing these case for support arguments, particularly because, as you say, you've done exactly this in recent times as you move towards your capital project. So tell us how you bring people on the journey with you. How do you gain confidence amongst your colleagues as you're trying to either refresh or develop a new case for support or set of key arguments that might be designed to speak to different audiences?
I think it's about that kind of data gathering. So it's having a clear sense of what your own business plan is, kind of why you are really doing this or what you're hoping to achieve, and then having to do quite a lot of work around how you do have those conversations with people and how you develop the shared dialogue and understanding of what you actually mean, because sometimes you go down the rabbit hole. The more of these things you write, the more strategic cases for support you have to write, the less some of this means in my experience. You start to lose your grip on what that strategic objective actually means. And when you're sitting with a staff team going, okay, we're going to have to move from being an organization that works out of rented offices and delivers work all over the place to operating a building, what is that going to mean? And everyone's gathering around looking at a strategic objective. It's often not that helpful. So I think you have to find different ways of having those conversations with your internal stakeholders, if that's a way of describing your staff and your board. One of the things that I think is quite interesting as well, we had never done economic impact work until we got involved with capital. And it was something that for years I've been really interested in doing, because I've always thought it would unlock some interesting figures, but also understanding of other areas where we impact. We're a development organisation, so we are a bit unusual in the arts world, I suppose, in that we are all about developing talent and setting people off on journeys where often other people are commissioning them and kind of paying them for things. And that stuff is hard to track. But having now done some of that work for the capital stuff, it is really transformative. And I think people around our organisation and my trustees were all quite staggered by some of the stuff that came back from the consultants looking at what our impact really was. And you start to go, oh my God, our impact is really, really high for the amount of resource we are bringing in. And I know, the economic impact, certain art forms have done that for a long time and are much better at doing that. In literature, that is still a very novel, very new thing. And it has been helpful to kind of have that alongside a better understanding of social impact as well, because together those things do tell quite a kind of motivating story of why it's worth doing some of this or why it's worth doing more of it. So that has been quite transformational for us, and I wish we'd done it a long time ago. Wish we'd found a way of resourcing that to slightly understand it. And it's still, that obviously is not so relevant for trusts and foundations, but it's still very, very relevant for public funders, and with UK shared prosperity and things like that. The kind of business cases that we're needing to make in those contexts, even though people claim to be really interested more in social impact, they still absolutely want the economic impact nailed. And I think that's interesting. And I was talking to a company in Belfast, actually, who are trying to develop, or who have a kind of prototype dashboard type thing, just following up with David's comment, that is trying to look at how you might track the public value of things like capital development or major investment programs over a much longer period of time, which I thought was really interesting, because I think I haven't come across many genuinely good examples of people who have kind of done that. And apparently in the public sector, capital investment isn't very well tracked, so whoever looks back 20 years later to see what the economic impact of a massive capital cultural development really was. And I think it's interesting. I suppose it's short-term political timelines that we're all working on for a lot of that kind of money. But it interests me that isn't happening, and I'm quite interested with our project to see if we could take a longer view of that.
That's fascinating, and just makes me think about, organizations who undergo capital projects will likely undergo a follow-up capital project down the line. And actually, if you were able to, in terms of your stewardship of that relationship with funders, be able to really share with them what that longer term impact is, I mean, that's incredibly compelling in terms of maintaining relationships and essentially building your case for support for the next time you might need to leverage their backing. That's really, really interesting. David, what are your thoughts on sort of bringing a team, a trustee team, a staff team along with you, particularly if you're trying to sort of develop or change your case for support arguments in this way?
What do I think? It's interesting for me because in Opera North, I guess my perspective, my role in the organisation was different to the role I've got here. So I'm, being the new person here coming in, saying, okay, I'm bringing this model with me, and then trying to get colleagues to engage with it. It's interesting because it's hard, because it asks hard questions, doesn't it? You're moving away from assumptions about audiences, assumptions about impact, assumptions about activity, and having to do some really detailed work thinking about why, for who. I think, that said, certainly my experience of it at Opera North is that when people start to understand the benefit of those ways of working, that it gathers a real momentum. And certainly where that happened at Opera North was around a project. Again, that thing about silos was around taking a really core project for the organisation, which was a co-production around Orpheus that was with the South Asian Arts UK. So it was about creating opera in a very different way with a partner company, and we brought the whole organisation into that theory of change and tried to find the connectives. How would the fact of that production on the main stage, how would it impact everything the organisation did, through from our work in schools, through in Harmony, through the work we were doing developing our young youth ensembles in the business, through to marketing, through to fundraising. And actually it was a very healthy and transformative thing to get. It was a model to bring all those people together to understand a shared impact, and also to shape the project, frankly. So once we gained the clarity around who it was going to be for and what we wanted to achieve, then we were able to deliver distinct programs of work or marketing campaigns or fundraising asks that were really tied to a coordinated and a coherent vision, I guess, which in somewhere like Opera North, where there's it's 250 people, it's a lot of people trying to do their different elements of creating that piece, was a different way of working, but I think a really beneficial one, and has started to gain traction there. But it's very early days here at Northern Ballet to do the same thing.
Well, it's brilliant to hear, and I think that the point about bringing everyone together around sort of a shared goal, what you're really saying is actually a huge benefit internally, but also externally it enables you to present a more cohesive picture.
Yeah, and I think this is connected. One thing, a very live conversation here in Leeds is council in Leeds, I would say, are fantastic backers of culture. They absolutely significantly invest, not just in organisations, but in things like Leeds 2023. And there's a really open and interesting dialogue evolving around what's the plan for our city. So that the three foundation stones of the plan for the city that the council is developing are around inclusive growth, health and well-being, and the environmental crisis. They think those are for this city, for the shape of this city, and what's their ambitions. They call it their plan for ambition. That's the sort of the core city plan, economic plan. But they're absolutely then talking to us as the cultural sector to say they're going to reshape their cultural investment program around those 3 pillars as well. And I guess as I'm doing the work here with teams around our case for support and our theories of change and understanding our impact and understanding our what's the data we have to understand what we're doing in the world, it's very definitely aligning with the council who want to engage with us around those 3 pillars. Does that make sense? So we're trying to, not that we should change what we do to fit, but I don't think you can argue with inclusive growth, health and well-being, and the environmental crisis. Those are important things. So I think the quality of work we'll do on theory of change and case for support will allow us to much more easily mesh with something like that as it's developed.
I think it's back to that idea, David, of being useful. I think your articulation of that kind of explains what I was kind of getting at with that it's not about us kind of going, we're here to make art, we'll live or die, and people must fund us to make art, but thinking about really what the value is of making that art in this place and how that relates to all the bigger changes we want to see. And I think once you're hyper locally or locally genuinely involved, you probably share those missions as well, and the work should reflect that. So I think it's been open to that, not because you need to follow the funding, but because you genuinely want to help make change and make things better in the place you are, So our views around things like the need for the well-being aspects of what we do to be a much bigger part of our programme, because there was an obvious need to supply our local authorities and local communities with that kind of stuff back of COVID, was a really clear business case for us, but also an emotional one. It's like we want to be doing the right thing for the people of this place. And if we know we can, why wouldn't we?
Absolutely. And I think there's some of the things I've been thinking around there's sort of the work you do with or at for people, but there's also how you make the work. So if I'm thinking about inclusive growth and health and well-being and environmental impact, what does that mean for the making of the thing we do, and who are we engaging over a longer period of time in that? What are the opportunities to engage with people around, I don't know, careers or in terms of environmental sustainability? Absolutely goes to the heart of how we make our economic ties in the city with the partners we work with and suppliers we use. I think that all of that needs working through as well in terms of being a useful and engaged partner in the city.
Thank you both so much. I feel a bit sad that really we've run out of time for me to ask you any more questions. And I just wanted to say, for me personally, a huge thank you for your generosity, in sharing your thoughts and some of your experiences and your views. It's been a really rich conversation, and it feels like a topic which we need to keep talking about and keep giving the oxygen to and for. And undoubtedly it will change, as we move forward, as the context around us changes as well. We have to wrap up this section now, but I'm sure people will reach out and get in touch if they want to ask you anything more specific. But for now, I'm going to pass back over to Cordelia to wrap up today's session.
Thank you, Deborah. And thank you both so much, Claire and David, for joining us. It's been a really, really interesting, different perspective. So yeah, thank you so much. And thank you also, Deborah, of course, for so expertly chairing today's session on behalf of Achates. If you are interested in finding out a bit more about what we do here at Achates and how we might be able to support your organisation, we offer services across fundraising, recruitment, strategy and organisational development. So please do feel free to get in touch to talk about how we might be able to help you. You can do this by emailing info@achates.org.uk. And of course, you are very welcome to join our next Achates Live, which will be broadcast on the 13th of July. More details will be shared soon, but we hope to see you then. And thank you again so much for joining.